All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining bright and early this Friday morning. Nothing like democracy first thing in the morning. I hope that this will be our last election law meeting, but hey, you never know. We call the meeting of the Election Law Subcommittee to order. And we have two bills that we're going to be discussing. They are cross files. So that aspect of it should be simple. We'll start with SB 632, Election Law Contested Elections. So this bill really deals with contested elections, also known as recounts, and the circumstances in which they can take place. The major provisions are that one, it allows campaign funds to pay for the cost of contesting an election. It also allows a government-funded recount when the margin of the contest is 0.25% or less. So currently, it would have to be at 0.1%. So this would allow us to, and in terms of when a government-funded recount could take place, to 5%. In addition, it prohibits a recount when the margin is greater than 5%. It also allows counties to provide funding to publicly finance candidates to pay the cost for contesting an election. So for those counties that do have the local campaign finance, they would be able to utilize that to pay for the cost of the contested election. And it requires in those cases the publicly financed candidates to establish a separate committee to pay costs for contesting an election. There are amendments to this bill. The amendments also establish a work group that will meet in the 2021 interim to develop a plan on risk limiting audits. We've talked previously about risk limiting audits being the gold standard around ensuring that our results are what they appear to be. And the work group would draft legislation and recommendations and a plan for consideration for 2022. So that is the short overview of the bill. And before we go into questions and things like that, I do want to just really go through this in a bit more detail with our real world examples so that we can all be clear on what we're voting on. So maybe Stan, if you can kind of take us through this, let's say Delegate Shoemaker and I are running against each other. He wins by a small margin. How does that, maybe it triggers a recount. Can you take us through how this bill would account for that?
Sure, yeah. So so basically how it would work is if it was a close margin and it was within, if the margin was within 0.25% of the total votes cast for both you and Delegate Shoemaker, then either of you, presumably whoever came in second, would file for a recount, and then the county would pay for that. But also, if either of you wanted to have legal assistance for the recount, then you could use your campaign funds to pay for that. But if either of you were accepting public financing, then you would set up a separate recount, or contested election committee is the term used in the bill, and the county could provide public funding for that if they chose to do that as part of their local system. And your fundraising for that contested election committee would be subject to the normal contribution limits under the public funding program. So that's basically how it would work.
Okay. Do we have any questions, Delegate Feldmark and then Delegate Shoemaker?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just to clarify, you were talking about the local public financing programs. So this would only apply in local elections, is that right?
No, that's just part of the bill. The change in the recount threshold, the government-funded recount threshold, applies to any election.
Okay.
And also the bill allows for the use of campaign funds to pay for the cost of a recount for any election.
I just wanted to clarify. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, not at all.
I just wanted to clarify. I think so. If a candidate is accepting public matching funds, then they have to set up this separate account for the recount for the contested election, right?
That's correct.
And I thought I heard you say that there could be public matching funds if the local program allowed for that.
Correct. It's not required. It's an option.
So what if it's a state? I mean, what if it's a gubernatorial race?
So the bill also,
the candidate had public financing.
Yeah, so the bill also says that if a publicly financed gubernatorial candidate wants to raise money for a recount, that they also have to set up a separate committee and would only be able to accept contributions for that committee that are allowed under the gubernatorial.
Okay, up to the 250 limit.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Is there any, because we have another bill that's looking at the gubernatorial public matching, right? Or is there any provision? I don't think that bill addresses provisions for a recount committee.
It doesn't. Jared, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I do have thoughts. Sorry, it does not address it. But I guess at this point here, that's something that if a recount or if the committee wants to address, if both these bills pass, that could be something addressed at next legislative session because of the timing of the election, and that recounts would be after the effective date. So that's something that you can look at for next session. But right now it allows and it establishes the framework for recounts, this bill for publicly financed gubernatorial candidates.
Okay, so both bills could proceed, and if any sort of reconciliation or cleanup is needed, we could do that next session.
Exactly, yes, right.
Okay. Thank you.
Delegate Shoemaker.
Thank you. I like this bill quite a bit, but there's one thing that gives me a little bit of pause. I heard a reference to the fact that if the margin between two candidates was 5% or greater, you wouldn't be able to seek a recount. That gives me a little bit of heartburn. I mean, how did we come up with that? I mean, is that a rule of thumb that other jurisdictions use that have similar statutes? How did we get there, and is there any flexibility on that? I guess those are my questions.
Great question. Stan and Jared, if you all could weigh in there.
Sure. So, I think that the sponsors just felt that when the margin is that large, it wasn't worth the time and the resources to do a recount in that scenario. The other jurisdictions vary. I was looking at this just the other day, and other jurisdictions vary a lot in terms of when they allow for recounts. Some of them, there's no threshold. Some of them, it only is allowed if there's a tie. There's just incredible variation. And so this is kind of, I think this is kind of in the middle of the pack on that. And I guess I would just also note that, there's the threshold for a government funded recount, which under the bill would be 0.25%. And then there's the threshold, beyond that threshold, you can still petition for a recount, but you have to pay for it yourself. But the bill doesn't.
So that'd be from 0.25 up to 5%, I guess, under this bill.
That's right. And beyond 5%, you just couldn't do it under the bill.
Right.
And sorry, really quickly, and to be clear, the above 5%, this is whether it's government funded, in no circumstance, basically, no recount over 5%.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, Chair. I just wanted to say, like, most recounts, you're not pulling tens of thousands of votes, and 5%, you're getting into that thousands of votes area there.
I get it. Okay. Thank you.
Madam, it's Bob Long. I have a question.
Yes, Delegate Lasanti had her hand up, so I'll go to her first and then we'll
Okay.
to you, Delegate Long.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just before I ask my question, I just want to clarify what I was hearing from the response to Delegate Shoemaker. The threshold is only for this bill pertaining to publicly financed gubernatorial candidates, correct?
No.
No. The threshold changes apply to all recounts. The only thing that's different for publicly funded candidates is that if they want to raise money for the recount, they have to have a separate committee. That's the only thing.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. And my other question is, can you walk me through the timeline for the recount?
Sure. So basically, that you don't actually petition, you don't actually file for a recount until after the election results are certified. So that would be, generally, within 2 weeks after the election. Generally it's by the second Friday that the results are certified, and then you have 3 days after that to file for a recount. And then that's when the recount would occur after that. And the timing, it just depends on how large a scale, how long it takes to do the recount. Just as an example, Baltimore County did a countywide recount in the county executives race in 2018 in the primary, and they were able to do it in 3 days. But it would vary, obviously. So
we're not prescriptive in this bill to say it has to be done by a certain date. Like you have 10 days after the request to get it done. So we're just going on good faith that they're going to do it in an expeditious manner.
Well, they have a very strong incentive to get that recount done as soon as possible because of the need for people to, especially local offices, for people to take office in early December.
Very quickly. Right. That was my concern, because a lot of them, it is a very quick turnaround. Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Delegate Long.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My concerns are the same with Delegate Shoemaker. And one of the things I want to add to that, if a candidate's willing to pay for a recount, I think they should be able to. That's my 2 cents. The other thing is too, with what's happened since the last election and the veil that it's kind of, the cloud that it's kind of put over our elections, I think that limiting recount actually even brings that cloud even closer, because I can hear my constituents now saying, look, why are we doing this? We have problems in the last one. If we need to have a recount, why are we limited to 5%? And that's where I'm coming from. So I totally agree with Delegate Shoemaker. I don't know if that made sense or not, but we want to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
It did to me.
Okay. Well, at least I got one.
Yeah.
Delegate Jones.
First, let me apologize as I fumbled to try to raise my hand. I think I hit other emojis, don't know what they were.
You were definitely clapping and agreeing with Delegate Long.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, Delegate Long. Let me be clear that I was not, with all due respect, clapping. I was definitely looking for that hand without my glasses on. I'm sorry. Could someone help me? What problems were in the last election? Have we had anything reported that would indicate there were problems? Does that go to Stan or does it go to Jared?
I think both of you, but I know Stan, you worked with the House bill sponsor in terms of some of the motivation around needing this. So is there anything to share around that?
Sure, yeah. I think the sponsors were concerned about 2 things with the bill. One is that the current 0.1% is so tiny that it excludes recounts, even in like the big example is that in 2014, there was a primary for Prince George's County Council that the margin was 6 votes, but that was outside the 0.1% margin. So there was no government funded recount. So that was part of the motivation. The other is that under the current law, there's no structure at all for raising money for a recount. It just says that any costs, that any money you raise toward a recount are not subject to the contribution limits. That's all the law says at all. So there's no limits, there's no transparency or structure of any kind. So they wanted to address that. And they also wanted to make sure that the counties could provide public funding for recounts because Montgomery County wanted that.
Good.
Because, they have public financing, correct?
Yes.
Right. That, and then regarding the last election, Stan, were there any problems in our last election that are on record or that we know of in any way, shape, or form?
Not that I know of. I don't know if Jared knows of any.
Jared, were there any problems in the last election that we know of in any way, shape, or form?
I mean, not in Maryland. I think it was a very smooth election and everything. And I just wanted to address the other delegates' concerns about the election process a little bit here too. Is that we do have our current post-election audit processes there as well that we try to do before certification, and which we post online. So there are processes that are in place now to help kind of streamline and make sure that the confidence in the equipment is there. And this bill also addresses that as well.
Right, the transparency portion. Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Chair.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a lot of interest in moving this bill forward, but there's definitely concern around this cap. So why don't we talk a little bit more about the 5% cap? And if I think that the point is to kind of remove just spurious recounts, especially when there's just a wide margin. Is there interest in either removing it, increasing it? So let's talk a little bit more about that. Delegate Shoemaker.
Well, I mean, Delegate Long made a good point. If candidates, and how often will this happen, by the way, but if candidates are willing to foot the bill for a recount, then why do we have a ceiling at all, it seems to me. And as Stan indicated, I mean, apparently there are states where there aren't any ceilings on this sort of thing. Of course, he also indicated that states are all over the place too, I guess. Is that fair, Stan?
Yeah, definitely.
But, how often, as a practical matter, do you think candidates are going to be willing to pony up the money for a recount when they're behind 10 points, for instance? So I mean, I'm not sure we need the 5% cap. That's just my 2 cents.
Delegate Shoemaker, do you have a verbal amendment?
I mean, I think if we're gonna have a cap, then why don't we make it 7 points?
Well, it sounded like you wanted to remove it.
Well, I do. I mean, I would like to remove it altogether. But if there's this overwhelming sentiment for a cap, then I think it should be higher than 5. My preference is not to be a cap.
Okay. All right. We'll come back to it. Delegate Lasanti had her hand up, and then we'll go to other members, and then we'll try to get some consensus.
Sure. And look, I do totally respect the idea of a cap when you're using public dollars, but when it comes to private dollars and having to use my good friend Delegate Shoemaker's quote, when you got to pony up the money and dig in your own pocket, that makes you think twice. But I do think it is necessary because there's always these, you always, to me at least, when you create law, you always want to create law for the worst case scenario. a ballot box broke, or something happened that we can't conceive. And at the end of the day, I believe I want to fall on the side of public trust with the outcome of the election. So if that means that somebody wants to dig in their pockets and have a recount, then that extra step to me just makes public confidence that much stronger. So I would definitely support, cutting it in half, basically having a cap for the public dollars, but for the private dollars, removing the cap.
Okay. Other thoughts, Delegate Feldmark, then Delegate Jones.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I do think I agree with the basic sentiment that if the candidate is paying for it, we don't need to limit when they can choose to pay for it. So I have a couple of questions related to that, though. One is, are the fees charged of the candidate or the campaign really sufficient to cover all the costs? Are we confident that there's no sort of shared burden with the local board? Do they really cover the costs?
They have to post a bond to cover the cost, which I believe is set by the local board. Is that right, Jared?
Yes.
Okay, so it really is a full covering of all costs associated with it, and staff time, everything. Okay.
Right.
So then my other question is, if we are removing, because it sounds like we may be headed towards removing the cap completely, which I'm okay with if the candidate is paying for it. I do then have a little bit of pause or question, maybe, if we're back to the publicly financed campaign, right? If the candidate's paying for it and it's over 5%, I'm not sure we want to use public dollars for a challenge over 5%. That's the only sort of nuance I see there.
I guess one thing I'd say is that the law is just, what this bill would just, it would allow the counties to provide public funding for a recount, and they could decide for themselves whether or not to provide it if the margin is, larger than they think is appropriate.
Okay, so the counties would have the authority to set that additional criteria of public funds can only be used if it's under a certain percentage.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
Okay. Then.
And I just want to point out here, sometimes, you might have a privately financed that's the losing candidate and the publicly financed candidate that's winning beyond the 5% margin. So you might, the publicly financed candidate would have to be involved in the defense of their win too. So
right, and then they shouldn't be restricted in their
right, exactly, right. So it's just
right. I was thinking of the sort of
the flip, and I was just like, right, yeah, right, where
right.
he was the candidate was losing and then doing that. So I just wanted to.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so we seem to have some good consensus on this, but I know there are other comments. So Delegate Long, Delegate Jones, it seems like you might still have your hand up. I'm not sure if that's the old hand or new hand. So let's go to, okay, great. Let's go to Delegate Long, Delegate Jones, and then let's go to Delegate Shoemaker. And I think that we can wrap these bills up after that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I completely agree with Delegate Shoemaker. I think removing this cap would definitely make it more transparent looking. I said this to Madam Chair back a while ago. Perception is reality. And if you think about that, whether just perception is really reality. What people see is what they believe. So we want to make sure people have the utmost confidence in our election. And anyway, again, that's my 3 cents worth.
Delegate Jones.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I guess I'm coming in with a whole nickel then, if that's 3 cents. I guess I'm old enough to remember several elections where, there were folks that it was clear they did not win, but wanted recounts, talked about recounts, and in some ways, I think hurt the public trust and called in a lot into question. I'm curious if we start, like, if there's a 10-point gap and a person just feels that there's no way they lost, they just know they were they can just call a recount and we can spend a lot of time. Now I understand it's potentially their money that would go into it, but then how long does this go on at a 8-10 point race? And they talk about needing a recount and we drag it out and drag it out. I'm trying to kind of look at all sides of this. And I think there have been a lot of great points made, but if there is no cap and anybody can call kind of a recount, what would that potentially look like in the end if somebody did lose by 8 points? Just because they had the money to do it.
Right. Those are definitely good points. And so I think that where we are is that this cap does prevent spurious recounts from taking place, and that we want to make sure that there are not instances where people are just widely doing that. I think at the same time, you know, someone wasting their time and money when they clearly lost by a lot is not as likely. But I'll also give it over to Stan and Jared if there was anything in current law that you all want to mention related to Delegate Jones' very fair point, and then we can go to Delegate Shoemaker and wrap this up.
I would just say that, I mean, it is current law that if the candidate wants to pay for it, that they can have a recount regardless of the margin. And I'm not aware of any cases where there's been a large margin and a candidate has insisted on a recount that they paid for. Are you aware of any, Jared?
Sorry, I was on mute there. There was a lot of talk. I think the most recent one was the special congressional election in 2020 in Maryland. There was a lot of talk about trying or doing a recount for that, but it never materialized. But outside of that, that it was pretty much.
I mean, part of it, I mean, if you're losing by 20 points, I think it'd be pretty hard to raise money for a recount.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And like I said, right, you're not finding tens of thousands of votes in recounts.
All right. Sounds like we have some consensus on this. Delegate Shoemaker.
Thank you. I mean, you know, just to respond to our good friend Delegate Jones, I mean, I think the cost attended with a recount is going to serve as a major deterrent for folks seeking spurious recounts. I mean, I know folks on election night say things in the heat of battle. You know, there's no way I could have possibly lost. I'm going to demand a recount, but when it comes time to follow through, they're not going to do it. So my motion would be to remove the ceiling, the 5% ceiling, and I make that verbally. That's my motion.
I second it. Any discussion about the motion to remove the 5% cap that prohibits recounts over a 5% threshold? Hearing none, all those in favor of this verbal amendment, please raise your hand. All right. All right.
Raising his hand.
Unanimous. Anyone opposed? Well, there's no one else to oppose. Okay, we're unanimous in supporting the verbal amendment, and it has been adopted on the bill. Now on SB 632 as amended.
Move favorable.
All right, favorable as amended, a second. Any further discussion? All right, all those in favor of SB 632 as amended, please raise your hand. All right. And that's another unanimous vote. We have moved forward to full committee SB 632 as amended. We now do have the House bill, which is our wonderful chair's bill. And I think we need to go ahead and adopt that same amendment on there. Well, let me look at if there were any other amendments on that so that we can be on the same page. Okay, so the amendments conform the bill to Senate Bill 632. And then it also adds that risk limiting audits work group that I mentioned. And then there's an additional amendment that we want to add. And let me just say verbally that last vote on the amendment was also on our other amendments to that bill. Everyone clear on that? Okay. Now on our chair's bill, which is HB 761, on amendments to this bill that conform it, add the risk limiting audits work group, and also the verbal amendment regarding removing the 5% cap. May I have a motion?
Move favorable on the amendments.
Second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on the amendments?
Madam Chair, I just wanted to mention that included in your amendments is fixing a drafting error. The 0.25% was supposed to apply both to candidate elections and to ballot issue elections, but
Okay.
frankly, when I drafted it, I forgot to make the change for ballot issue elections, so that's included in the amendments you have.
Okay.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Okay. All right, any discussion on the amendments? Hearing none, all those in favor, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
All right, any opposed? Okay, we're unanimous again. Well, on the amendments. Now on the bill as amended, House
Move favorable.
761, wonderful.
Second.
I think someone seconded.
Somebody.
Second. Yeah.
Okay.
So you help, Mark.
Okay, it's been properly moved and seconded. Any discussion on HB 761? Okay, hearing none. All those in favor of HB 761 and or say aye.
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 All right, wonderful. Unanimous vote for both bills. And really want to thank again the work of this committee. Look at us working together, problem solving, bipartisan. Thank you so much for the wonderful and thoughtful discussion. And thank you so much, Delegate Shoemaker, for helping to drive that conversation and sharing your concerns.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
No problem.
Particularly you, Madam Chair.
Oh, no problem. Wonderful working with this group.
Oh,
So-
boy.
All right. So I think that is all of our business at this point. Delegate Vice Chair Washington, do you have something? Okay. All right. So it's almost time for floor, and I'll be sure to let y'all know if we meet again, but hopefully this will be our last time.